Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachijian, and today I'm joined by Courtney Reardon. Courtney recently became the 68th American woman to summit Mount Everest and survive. An unlikely person to find herself at the highest point on Earth, she has worked in finance in New York City for the past 12 years and is currently a senior vice president in business development at an asset management firm. After graduating from Columbia University, she began working on Wall Street at Bear Stearns and subsequently Bank of America Merrill Lynch and Bank of Montreal Capital Markets. Courtney developed her love of the outdoors later in life, during the depths of the financial crisis. Swapping out her usual dresses and high heels, she uses her vacation time from work to climb some of the world's highest peaks, such as Mount Everest, Denali, Kilimanjaro, and Vincent Massif in Antarctica, among other peaks. Courtney is also my spouse, and while I don't usually like to get personal here or reveal private details on the internet, I think summiting Everest warrants an exception. As Courtney will talk about, for a few weeks prior to the climb, our apartment was transformed into an altitude chamber. What's really powerful about listening to Courtney discuss her Everest experience is her willingness to share her sense of vulnerability and doubt. We often perceive people who achieve impressive feats as being totally different than ourselves. All of us experience self-doubt. The things that elicit that doubt just vary from person to person. These doubts can create an inner chaos. Courtney describes how to manage that chaos as well as one possibly can. This podcast is brought to you by Resilient Performance Systems. If you enjoy the material here, please check out our website at www.resilientperformance.com and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future podcast episodes, articles, and upcoming content, including training templates and live and online courses. The sign-up link for the newsletter is in the show notes. Podcast listeners will receive a discount on all paid content by entering the coupon code PODCAST. That's PODCAST in all capital letters. Additionally, please consider writing an iTunes review if you find these podcast conversations informative. They help us continue to attract high-quality guests. Here's Courtney Reardon. Courtney, thank you so much for joining us. You have a pretty impressive climbing history that we're going to get into in a little bit, but before we talk about some of your more well-known climbs, what was the impetus for you getting into climbing and outdoor activities in the first place? You didn't really grow up in a place where you had access to mountains, and I know that since you graduated from college, you've been working in finance. So what made you want to take that first step, so to speak?
One of the gifts of the financial crisis, I guess. I was working at Bear Stearns, and I realized in a moment when the bank was going under that all of my books and movies and documentaries all seemed to center around this one thing, and it was the outdoors and climbing in particular, mountaineering. And I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to do anything. I needed somebody to show me how to do it. So after Bear Stearns, I ended up going to Merrill Lynch, which a month later was merged with Bank of America, and the financial crisis was a mess. And I decided that if I were going to get laid off, I wanted to do something in the outdoors and kind of explore this interest that I had cultivated. I didn't get laid off, so instead I did a 2-week Knowles backcountry skiing and winter camping course in Wyoming, and that kind of kicked it off. And that's kind of where it began.
What is Knowles for people who aren't familiar with it?
It's a National Outdoor Leadership School. So they typically do courses for college-age students or right after college. And it's like a very hardcore version of Outward Bound. So their goal is to teach you how to thrive and survive in the outdoors and enjoy the outdoors through different activities, whether they're climbing, backpacking, different activities in the outdoors.
Okay, so your first outdoor climbing centric trip was the Knowles trip that you did. I know that Knowles offers a variety of courses. What specifically was the first Knowles course that you took? Because I think that's going to provide some insight into what you got into later on.
It was winter camping and backcountry skiing. And I actually only did that course because I had fractured my foot running, like a stress fracture, and I couldn't do the one I originally signed up for, which was light and fast backpacking. the irony here is not lost on me. I'm very slow, and that I was signing up for a fast backpacking trip was, yeah, not a good idea. And instead, I switched to winter, which is the slowest moving and somehow something that I'm good at. But that's kind of how I got into it.
Okay, and then where was that first trip, that first Knowles trip that you took?
We flew into Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And from there, we went into kind of the Utah area. And you're carrying all of your gear in sleds, and we were using telemark skis. Nobody knew how to tele at the time. So it's kind of a level playing field. And we went up, got hit with, you're there for 2 weeks. We built these snow shelters where you basically pile up the snow and let it sit overnight, and then start to hollow it out from the top and from the side. And you can hollow it out enough that 4 people can sleep in these snow shelters, which was amazing. Soon after we built those snow shelters, we got stuck in a snowstorm, and it snowed like 3 feet. And I think the temperatures got down to minus 10 degrees with wind chill. And I loved it. I thought it was fun and exciting, and it was cool to be out there in a storm, but I felt safe in these snow shelters that we built. It felt very self-sustaining.
So were you actually sleeping outside for the entire 2 weeks? Like, talk about that, because if you haven't done that before, that's kind of a pretty radical shift to go from, working an office job in New York City to spending like 2 straight weeks in the outdoors.
I think maybe the first 4 days we slept in a wooden lodge while we were learning how to telemark ski. And then for about a week and a half, we went and slept. First, I think we spent 2 nights in a yurt, which is a temporary structure, wood and canvas. And then we slept in a tent while we were letting the snow settle before we began to dig our snow shelter. So we probably slept in the snow shelters for about a week total, and outside for a little bit more than that.
And are those snow shelters pretty comfortable? You're talking about like negative 10-degree temperatures. Like, were you able to stay warm? Did they do their job?
Oh, they're awesome. There's no wind. You're kind of warm in there. There were 4 people. The area where you get most cold is from the ground up. So there's a little layer between you and the ground, like a pad that kind of tries to insulate you from that. But that's the spot where you're most likely to get cold.
Okay, so that's pretty much your first structured outdoor experience, and presumably there was something that captivated you from that experience that made you want to do additional outdoor related trips. So what was it about that first trip that really captivated you and made you decide, I want to take the next step? And what was that next step for you?
The trip was so hard. I was in over my head. I was terrified. The courage it took to sign up for it, I thought. And then I got there and I'm like, oh my God, I'm not a great skier, let alone a telemark skier. When we started pulling the sleds, it was 2 days uphill, kind of trudging a trail through the forest, basically. And it was so hard. I was shocked at how hard it was and how much more I could have done in terms of training. In fact, after the climb, and maybe this is what made me, or after the ski trip, and maybe this is what made me enjoy it the most, I had signed up for a half marathon maybe a month after this trip. And the night before the half marathon, I decided that I had always wanted to run a marathon, but I'm kind of a combo of active and very lazy, just generally in life. So I had always wanted to run a marathon, but I decided I don't really want to train for another one. Like a half marathon training was hard enough for me. I don't want to put in the work again. So what if I just run the whole thing this time? Like, I've already trained for the half. Maybe if I go slow enough, I can run the whole thing. And I did. At mile 17, I'm thinking to myself, like, wow, this is the farthest I've ever run. This is cool. But that Knowles trip was so much harder. And I did that. And so it kind of gave me confidence to fuel me in other ways that I didn't anticipate, because it was so difficult. It was so difficult, and I didn't think I could get through it, that kind of when the next physical challenge came, I rose to it, and I did it, and I was still surprised, and it just gave me a lot more, backing, confidence in myself, and willingness to even try.
All right, that's very cool. And I mean, the spoiler here is that you eventually summit Mount Everest, but I still want to kind of go from the initial Knowles experience where you were outside for the first time to the steps in between. So, I guess without getting into too much detail about each individual mountain, maybe just talk about, that journey from that first Knowles trip where you're sleeping in a snow cave for the first time and doing some backcountry skiing to what made you develop the confidence to say, like, okay, I'm ready to at least attempt to climb Mount Everest. And what was the point at which, throughout your climbing journey, you actually considered like Everest might be a viable option for you?
So after that Knowles backcountry ski course, about 6 months later, I realized that I really loved that environment of being out in the winter. It felt even more raw and authentic to be outside in the winter, like I was, holding a secret or something. Like I was doing something rogue. But I started to realize that if I wanted to do more winter activities, I had to kind of get into climbing. Mountaineering was a way that I could, look, I was busy with work. I didn't have time to plan these climbs. And mountaineering was a way that I could just sign up for a climb, have reputable, strong guides there to make sure that we're safe, planning the route, planning the rations, and all I had to do was train and show up. So I decided to take an intro mountaineering course. Instead of doing kind of a local one in Washington State, I was like, let's go all the way. So I went to Denali in Alaska. We didn't try to summit. We just kind of stayed around base camp, and I learned, crevasse rescue, self-arrest, rope work, crampon footwork, the basics of climbing and climbing technique. And then from there, it just kind of exploded. Like anytime I could possibly be in the outdoors, I wanted to do it. It was like fuel and food for my soul. I loved it. And I took any moment I could. Every vacation I took, I was sleeping in a tent, probably for about 5 or 6 years until we started vacationing together. But then I kind of had this thought, like when I went to Denali for that intro mountaineering course, half of my photos were of the climbers. Like I was shocked by them. Like these people were out there for 3 weeks, and I saw the mountain that they were climbing and how they carried themselves by foot from where I was standing to all the way to the summit and back down. And I was just in awe of that. And I was too intimidated to consider climbing Denali at that time. I thought maybe someday, but I didn't know when. And I kind of moved on and started doing other smaller, more manageable climbs. But then there was a day when it felt like Denali was ready for me, and I was ready for Denali, and the timing seemed right. And I had a friend who was guiding Denali, and I really wanted to go with her, and I really wanted to go with the team, and I didn't want to wait another year. I felt prepared, and I felt like I knew how to train better. I actually had done, I think, another Denali prep course. So I had done 2. And this guide who was going to take me on Denali basically told me, no more prep courses. You're ready. You can't prepare anymore. It's time for the show. So she kind of pushed me, and that's how I ended up there. And the Denali team ended up all being first responders. It was a former Delta Force guy who was an ER doctor, 2 EMT firefighters, a woman who was in the Air Force Academy on the track team, and then me. And they were all obviously very physically strong, but something that I had that I didn't fully appreciate until Denali was that it was like I was on vacation. I was enjoying myself. Like we're out in the wilderness. this. Like, we're climbing this mountain. And any little setback really kind of rolled off my back. It didn't bother me that much because it wasn't that big of a deal. And we were still moving forward, and things would have a way of working itself out. And even if I didn't get to the summit, I got all this experience and I had a great time. I met cool people. So we ended up making it to the summit. And this woman, this guide, Christina, turned to me at the end when we were flying off the glacier. And she had already climbed it multiple times. And this woman spends 300 days a year outside guiding. And she turned to me and she said, I can't believe you did that. I can't believe you just climbed that whole mountain. Like, I'm so proud. I'm so proud of you. Coming from her, that meant a lot because she's very accomplished. That sustained me for a while. I was really happy with that. I didn't have the need to go any higher, do any other mountains. I dreamed about doing a traverse of Denali, which is like so hard. And I still want to do that. But about a year and a half later, 2 years later almost, we were out in the mountains and I realized I really missed it. I really missed the expedition, and there's this personal growth that it gives you that I needed. And so the idea to climb an 8,000 meter peak came to me in August, and within a year I did it.
Very cool. So just to clarify for people, your initial experience on Denali, you didn't attempt to summit the mountain. You just went there to learn basic mountaineering skills, and you subsequently took some other courses that were Denali prep courses where they were trying to, again, train you and prepare you to develop the skills to ultimately try to summit the mountain. So you'd been doing this stuff for a couple years, right, before you actually attempted to summit Denali, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think before I attempted to summit Denali, I had been climbing for 6 years. And before I even considered Everest, it was about 8 years.
Okay. And what is it about, because, for people who aren't familiar with Denali, it's the highest peak in North America. What is it about Denali that kind of gave you the confidence that you might be ready to ultimately at least attempt to do Everest? What made it challenging?
Denali is a slog. They sometimes call Denali the anti-Everest because there are no Sherpas or porters. Nobody's helping you set up your tent. You're basically doing it all on your own. So you carry about 100 pounds in total from the base camp. You've got about 40 pounds in a sled and 60 pounds on your back. So this is very heavy, hard climbing. It's 3 weeks entirely on snow. It's a slog. It's exhausting. There's also, like, Everest is kind of like Hollywood. Everybody knows what Everest is. Denali, nobody gives a shit that you just climb this thing. You only do it for yourself. It's really hard, and there's no praise at the end of it. Okay.
So talk about, I know there's really no typical day on some of these mountains, but as far as the routine, like, let's say a hard day on Denali, you wake up in the morning at a certain time, and then talk about from the, even just the little things that you might think aren't a big deal, but like just the logistical hassle of putting your camp away or getting your gear ready to climb for the day. And then you climb for however many hours or vertical feet, then getting to your next camp and building, like, talk about like all those little things that you might take for granted. 'Cause I want people to appreciate like how just arduous even the smallest things are on these mountains.
Okay. So Denali is in Alaska, and in the summer, it's daylight 100% of the time, all the time. You wake up maybe at 7 a.m. There's a group tent. You'll all go into the group tent and have, breakfast and hot water, hot tea, whatever your fancy. You're there for maybe an hour. Everybody's having breakfast. We're talking about the weather, what the plan is for the day. All right, we're going to pack up camp and move in an hour. So 9 a.m., you're going to start packing up camp, which means taking down all the tents, packing up all of the kitchen cook pots, spatulas, fuel that you're using for the stoves. You need to melt water to make, you need to melt snow to make water. So that takes a lot of fuel. Everybody's got their, bathroom break time. Meanwhile, you're hydrating at the same time to make sure that you don't get, too dehydrated because you're moving all day. Then, all right, you packed up camp. You've got it in your sled. You're tying down your sled. You're stuffing everything you possibly can into your backpack. And you start moving to the next camp. Typically, you're going to be climbing, I don't know, maybe like 5 or 6 hours to the next camp. Part of what we'll do some days, it's so much gear that it's hard to carry all at one time. So sometimes you'll just be carrying gear up the mountain and then you'll bury it in the snow and you'll walk back down to camp. But if you're moving camp, you take everything up with you. And you'll be climbing for 4 to 5 hours. And then when you get to camp, this is where the actual real work begins. The moving is not that difficult. You're winded, you're going slowly, you're trying not to sweat so you don't get cold. But when you get to the new site where you're going to build camp, you have to, again, stop, make sure you're hydrating because you're likely to get dehydrated. You have to stop and kind of pick a spot that's level, start to find areas where you can, build tent platforms, which are level platforms in the snow, ideally a little bit sunken in the snow because you want to block yourself from the wind. So you figure out which direction the wind is coming, and that's going to determine which direction you set up your tent. You're setting up your tent, and at the same time, some of your teammates are building snow walls to block your tent from the wind, because a windy night in a tent is like being out on the wing of an airplane. It's so loud and everything's flapping around. And you also don't want your tent to collapse, which is possible on some mountains. So you're staking everything down so the wind doesn't take it, including your tent. And then at the same time, some of the guides are typically melting snow to make water for everyone to keep drinking and for cooking dinner that night. Everyone gets back together in the team tent. We call it the posh tent because it's fancy, if you will. It's not really fancy, but you're helping the team build that and put it together and anchor it down. Then everybody gets together for dinner, and maybe around 7 p.m., 8 p.m., you're done with dinner, and everybody gets into their tents because that's the warmest spot in your sleeping bag. And you hang out in there for maybe 10 hours, which I love because I'm obsessed with sleep. And yeah, you're tired. It's a hard day.
And you're doing that for 3 weeks in a row, basically.
Yeah. Do you want to know about the hardest day on Denali?
Sure.
It's actually not the summit day. It was after the summit. When you get to the summit, it's so exciting, but you're depleted afterwards. And climbers all know that most accidents happen on the way down. So as a result, you kind of before I even get to the summit, I'm like, oh God, we have to go down. Like, it's the hardest part. You have to control your footwork. You have to be paying attention. There's a lot of focus required. So after the summit, which is about 20,000 feet and change, we come back down to Camp 17,000 feet. That night, I actually can't get warm. I'm shivering. The fact that I'm shivering, everybody tells me is good because it means I'm not getting hypothermia. Wonderful. But I end up having to get inside 2 sleeping bags. So I'm in a -10 sleeping bag inside another -10 sleeping bag. I don't know what that is now, -40 or something. And the next day I'm pretty exhausted. I'm wasted, to be honest. And it's a storm coming. So we have to get down to Camp 14. We leave in the beginnings of the storm, and the snow starts swirling around. We're going down this ridge line. I'm an idiot, so I'm wearing my glacier glasses instead of my goggles. They end up freezing on the inside with the snow swirling around. there's fresh snow on top of the ridge line, and with my glasses freezing and fogged up, I can't tell if I'm stepping on the ridge line or if I'm stepping off the side of it. So I yelled at my teammate ahead of me. I'm like, Jeff, I can't see the rope ahead of me. I can't see where I'm going. He's like, just follow the rope, which is like a black line. I'm like, oh my God, okay. So I do that, and I end up like going off course at one point for a little bit, and the snow is like up to my waist. And I'm kind of clawing myself out thinking like, this is terrible. I can't believe guides would bring idiots like me up here. But the guides were like, you're all fine. You'll be fine. I'm like, okay. So we go down the fixed lines, which is a little tricky, very steep, and get to Camp 14, only for me to realize that we're actually going down to Camp 11,000 feet. We've got way more to go. It was terrible.
So you end up, successfully summiting Denali, and as it occurs with most climbers, because the lure of climbing tends to be the personal challenge, once you achieve one thing, naturally the next question is, well, what can I do? What's the next challenge, right? And for you, that ended up being Everest, which probably at one point in your life would have just seemed so far-fetched. And now that you've summited Denali, it seems attainable. But what made you decide, like, okay, I'm going to do this?
I wasn't sure if I was ready for an 8,000 meter peak, and specifically Everest. But the work I did, I looked at all the 8,000 meter peaks, all 14 of them, and kind of crossed off the ones with the highest death rates, like K2 and Annapurna. Like, clearly I'm not qualified for those at that point. And started to do a little bit of research about all the other ones and talked to a bunch of my friends that were guides, people that had been on the mountain. And I came to learn that Everest was the lowest death rate of all the 8,000 meter peaks. It's the safest. It has the most rescue infrastructure, and I decided that was the route that I wanted to go. Also because if I go into my boss at the time and say, hey, I'd love to take 2 months off to go climb Makalu, they're going to laugh me out of the room. If I ask for Everest, they'll maybe take me seriously. The big thing was I talked to my guides from Denali, that woman Christina in particular, and then the other guide had also climbed Everest twice. So I wanted to know if he felt like I was qualified. He had climbed with me on Denali and he'd been on Everest. He was the best person to ask as to whether he felt I was strong enough for Everest. And when I spoke to Christina, who talked with him, she said absolutely. And she qualified that and said it wasn't just that I was physically strong. She felt like I was strong enough for that, but that I had an attitude that worked well in the mountains and responded well to setbacks. Like if somebody could be a lot physically stronger than me, but a bad night's sleep, could throw them out of whack. She said, those are people that are like Ferraris, and you're much more like a pack mule. Which is now why pack mules and cockroaches are my spirit animal, because they are the most resilient.
Yeah, you've got to be able to function when you're not optimal. Okay, so you decide like I'm going to do this, but small problem is that you live in New York City where you don't really have access to tall mountains or to high altitude. So how did you prepare to train for Everest living in New York City, and how much time did you allot to do that?
Most people take a year to train for Everest or any 8,000 meter peak. I did it in 3 months. That's a short amount of time, obviously. I basically did whatever you told me to do. But at the same time, because I had the Denali
Which was what though?
Which was the big thing was my gym. The gym I normally go to, miraculously, 5 Points Academy had this incline treadmill that had 30% incline, and they let me leave a 50-pound weight vest there. So I would walk on that in sets of 20 minutes as fast as I could, breathing through my nose. And I eventually built up to being able to do 4,000 vertical feet in one session. It took me like 3.5 hours, but I did it. The other thing was I had some climber friends who lived in Brooklyn, and they let me use their weights and in a backpack, carry their weight, and I would climb the stairs in their high rise for hours, skipping stairs, breathing through my nose because you told me to, listening to podcasts. Then I also did a strength training routine with you twice a week, and some sprinting in place interval workouts. Every once in a while, I would do this thing where I would pull a like lateral sled drag with 140 pounds or something, because that mimics the crossover step in climbing. And I think that that's mostly what I did.
Yeah, and then obviously you didn't really have much time to pre-acclimatize to the altitude there. So can you talk about how you modified your home to prepare for the altitude on the mountain?
Oh my gosh, this was ridiculous. So my guide service is really on the forefront of home acclimatizing. It's a big thing among European cyclists, and I was climbing with an Austrian team. So they strongly suggested, maybe insisted, that we all pre-acclimatize at home. What this means is that I was sleeping in a hypoxic tent, basically a tent that is pumping nitrogen into the tent. At first, they sent me this big tent for both Doug and I to sleep in. It fit our entire mattress and bed. That wasn't going to work. He wasn't eager to go, sleep at 16,000 feet. So they sent me a little head tent, which was like a clear plastic cube that fit around my head, and there was a loud air pump, like pumping into my little cube, some air that had reduced oxygen levels in order to get my red blood cells to start responding to the altitude. So at home for about 3 weeks, I slept in this thing and essentially acclimatized up to about 16,000 feet.
Yeah, so if you can envision this, it's basically you're taking what amounts to almost a tent and putting it on top of your bed, and the tent is supposed to take up half the bed space, but ended up taking up about 3/4 of the bed space. So I had zero desire to sleep at 16,000 feet, especially because I wasn't going on the climb, and I value sleep quality, which is not always altitude's not always conducive to that, but obviously it's something that's very helpful if you're preparing for an expedition at high altitude. But I wish I'd taken a picture of it because it was kind of a disaster, but it's funny and something that we laugh about now. So you're at this point, you've done all of your physical training, you've turned your bedroom into an altitude chamber, and now you show up for the climb, and you go to meet your team. And I know that you had a very uniquely accomplished team. So can you talk about some of the backgrounds of the other people on your team, because they're much different than yours?
Oh my gosh, my team. They were incredible and incredibly intimidating. Our leader, Rupert, was famous for a rescue he performed on Everest in 2013. He, 300 feet before the summit, rescued a snowblind American climber. Snowblind is essentially when your eyeballs get sunburned. So he rescued this person just before the summit instead of going to the summit himself, and takes this guy all the way down the most dangerous part of the mountain, the ridgeline on the north side of Everest.
With no oxygen, correct?
Yes. So he's famous because he did this when he wasn't using supplemental oxygen, and he didn't have any Sherpa support. He was climbing this solo. It's rare for somebody to be able to perform a rescue like this from the summit. That's extremely rare, let alone to be able to do it without using supplemental oxygen. I don't think anybody who's not using oxygen is typically even able or has the energy to perform any sort of rescue, even to help somebody. Most people that are climbing without supplemental oxygen have extra partners around them, looking after them, taking care of them. There's a famous climber who tells a story about when he did it. He fell asleep on the ladders because he was so exhausted after the summit. So that's our leader. Probably one of the most accomplished climbers I'll ever interact with in my life. Then it was 3 other guys. They were all from Germany and Austria. One of them had already climbed an 8,000 meter peak, Choyu, and had already been to, I think, Camp 3 on Everest South Side. So he was very experienced. The other 2 guys were ultra marathon runners. Like, one of them runs a marathon in less than 2.5 hours. And the other guy was telling me a story about how he ran this foot race through the Alps that's basically to see how far you can run in 24 hours straight. These guys run a marathon like every weekend. They don't even call it a marathon, they call it a Saturday.
Right, and then you have your desk job in New York, and you're walking up the stairs, a couple days a week. So yeah, you said, I mean, you're obviously intimidated by that, right? Did you feel like you were at a place? Like, what was that dynamic like initially?
I don't know what they were thinking, but I was like, oh my God, what have I got myself into? I kept reminding myself that I tried to remind myself that I had some vital experience, that Denali was unique in that you're on snow for so long, so that being comfortable in an uncomfortable environment, that's what I'm good at. I kept trying to remember that and think about that. But yeah, it was like, I got to conserve my energy because I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep up with these guys. And frankly, I couldn't keep up with them. On hikes, they were often hours ahead of me, and it wasn't easy.
So did you ever think that maybe like you were lucky to be in a team with so many accomplished people, or were you more thinking like I might be the weak link and you were worried that you were going to let them down?
Both. I knew I was lucky to be on such a team because if somebody has a problem, all of the resources gravitate to that person, as they should. And I felt like this was a group of people where it's unlikely somebody's going to have a problem. And then I came to the realization that if somebody's going to have a problem, unfortunately, it might be me. And I was still very intimidated. And there were times that I was also comparing myself to them, not to the average Everest climber. And so it became very difficult for me to measure myself against them when they were so accomplished and successful and fit and strong and German.
Okay. Was there ever a point where you thought that maybe that kind of feeling of unease and maybe almost like feeling like you're unworthy of the rest of your team actually elevated your performance? I know just from like my experiences in the military, like part of what makes the military work really well when it does work, at least on kind of like a tactical level and an individual unit level, is that sense of cohesion, which tends to be driven by, I just don't want to fail the people that are next to me. And if you're in a unit that has very high standards, then you're always worried about kind of being unworthy of your comrades in arms. So was there ever a point where you felt like, okay, I'm actually doing better as a result of being scared of failing these people, or did it more really make you feel just like you were questioning your own ability?
100%. Before I even got to that point, I was completely dejected and demoralized, and I was so depressed that I wasn't able to keep up with them, that I wasn't good enough to be on this team, that I was the weakest link, that I'd never been the weakest on a team. Maybe I was never the strongest, but just trying to hang in with these guys was hard enough for me that I spent all of my energy trying to keep up with them. At one point, I thought I had figured out a solution, and in my head, I pretended like I'd start the hike before them, the hike to Advanced Base Camp. I'd start before them, an hour before maybe, and I'd pretend that they were chasing me. So in my head, I was like running, trying to stay ahead of them. Like I'd be scared. And then eventually they'd pass me. And this happened over and over again. I couldn't keep up with them. but I think not wanting to let them down, I kept promising them that I was better at the more difficult part of the climb, the stuff that was much more like Denali than I was the hiking over rocks and stones, the lower part of the mountain. But at some point, I didn't even believe it, so I couldn't expect them to.
Okay, so can you elaborate on because you're basically, this is like a 2 month ordeal from the time you leave your apartment in New York to the time you get back. Can you talk about like the way that you climb the mountain in stages and the logistics of it? And then while you're doing that, talk about what was the most difficult part of the climb for you personally, and kind of the dynamics with the team, because you've kind of planted the seed for like how you want a really experienced team with like great athletes, people who have unlimited access to mountains, and then there's you, and you kind of feel like an outsider. So talk about just the logistics of climbing the mountain in stages, and then the points at which you personally doubted yourself the most, and how that kind of related to the rest of the team.
Yeah, so it is a 2 month process. And the reason it takes 2 months is because climbers don't simply go higher and higher and higher on the mountain. Instead, what you do is, after about a week at base camp, which is 17,000 feet, you hike for 2 days up to advanced base camp. Then you go all the way back down to base camp. Then the second part is going up higher beyond advanced base camp to Camp 1. Then again, you go all the way back down to base camp. And only then do you begin your summit push all the way up to the summit and back down. So you're spending about a week at base camp and a week at each of the other stages to let your body acclimatize and get used to the altitude. The part that was the hardest for me personally was the lower half of the mountain. And the reason that this was significant and difficult to deal with is that that's the part of the mountain you're going through over and over again. So I basically didn't get to have this moment where I was good enough for the team until we got onto the snow, which was about a month and a half into the expedition. So I was the weakest for the majority. And I don't mean the weakest, I mean significantly the weakest. I sucked. I hated myself. I was ashamed that I had even showed up thinking I could climb the mountain. And it, I was paranoid. I felt like I was letting them down. I felt like they weren't making eye contact with me because they knew I was, the weakest link. And what do you do with the weakest one? Fucking cut it off. I was worried that they were all speaking German and I couldn't understand, and they had previously been better about speaking English. And I don't even know if this was real or not, because it may have all been entirely in my head because I was feeling so insecure and ashamed of my performance.
Okay, so what was the point at which you feel like you earned the trust of your team, when you kind of like sort of began to conquer that doubt a little bit?
So on the second rotation, we go up to Camp 1, which is on top of the North Col. It's 1,000-foot ice wall, and it's really where the climbing starts. So we all go up independently with our assigned Sherpa partners, and it's a little bit, there are other people and we're passing them, and everybody's kind of going at their own pace, but you're also kind of trying to just go faster than the other teams that are on the ropes. So we all reconvene and sleep at a tent at the top of this 1,000-foot ice wall. I sleep well because I've got this Denali experience. I assumed everybody else slept well, but the next morning when our guide Rupert suggests that we should climb a little bit higher to get our bodies acclimated a little further, I raise my hand and I'm like, oh, should I sit this out? Because I'm the weakest one. Maybe I should save my energy. And he's not having it. He's like, we're going to go. We're all going to go. And so as the weakest person, I decide to be right behind the guide, because that's where you want the person who needs the most help. So We all move up. It's Rupert in the front, and then me, and then my team close behind me. We're all climbing. An hour goes by, and Rupert kind of pulls over. We're taking a little quick bio break, and I stop, and I look downhill, and my teammates are way behind me. I don't know what happened. I figured at the time that they were playing a joke on me or something, or like teasing me to like give me an ego boost or something. When they eventually catch up, they tell me that they couldn't keep up with me. It was as if I had some booster pack on, and you know, they were nice about it. They weren't laughing or anything, and I wasn't smiling because I'm trying to be polite too, because they were looking at each other like, what the hell just happened here? And I tried to quietly say, like, see, I told you I was better on the snow and ice than I am on the rocks and stones. Honestly, I didn't believe it myself anymore at that point, but it was this moment of finally feeling like I was worthy of my team and that I belonged to this team was more valuable to me than the summit. Like, it was the moment, A, that I knew I would summit and be okay, but B, that I finally let go of this gorilla I had been carrying around for the past month and a half.
Okay, so, and then from that point on, did you feel like once you were permanently off the rocks and onto at the higher altitudes where there was more snow, that you really kind of found your stride? And a lot of like climbing and performance is about just getting in that mental state where you just feel like you're operating at your peak. You're not thinking, you're just kind of acting. Is that what it was like from, once you proceeded towards the summit?
Yeah, after that moment, we actually went back down. And again, I was still the slowest on the lower parts of the mountain, but it didn't mean as much. It didn't matter. Everybody's like, oh yeah, save your energy here. Of course, you want to save it for when we get up higher. Like they weren't judging, or they weren't judging me for it, and I wasn't judging me for it. It seemed more strategic. But then when we went back up higher in the mountain, I just kept getting better and better.
Okay. And I want to talk a little bit about the altitude and the oxygen, because you keep bringing up acclimatizing, and I don't think people, unless you put it in perspective, really appreciate like what this lack of oxygen can do to your body. So I think you mentioned, and I've heard you give a talk where you talked about like something about how if a helicopter could fly to Everest, how long an unacclimatized person could actually live up there. So maybe kind of recount that fact, and then talk about the point at which the team or most climbers actually go on oxygen, like the altitude and what that's like, and then your own little snafu with the oxygen when you were heading towards the summit.
Yeah. So the story is, if there was a helicopter capable of landing on the summit, there isn't. But if there was, a person could only survive up there for 30 minutes if they weren't acclimatized. What also happens at this altitude, there's only 1/3 as much oxygen in the air as there is at sea level. So when you're moving at this altitude, it basically feels like you're traveling with a plastic bag over your head, like running with a plastic bag over your head upstairs. That's what climbing feels like. It's terrible and wonderful. So people typically, I think only like 2% of people have climbed Everest without supplemental oxygen. What supplemental oxygen does is it effectively makes the mountain feel about 3,000 feet lower. So instead of feeling like 29,000 feet, it'll feel like 26. What it also does is it makes you feel warmer. It keeps your circulation going, so you're less likely to get cold injuries on your fingers and toes, frostbite. On our summit day, I had a little issue where I'm climbing, and we go over the second step, which is a really complicated part of the climb. And for some reason, as I get off the second step, I have to lift my oxygen mask to catch my breath. This is idiotic. That's not what should be happening. I should be getting oxygen pumped through the mask, not having to catch my breath out in the air where there's no oxygen, essentially. So what we later find out when I'm catching my breath, I flag our guide and my Sherpa down and tell them what's happening. And I can hear this loud hissing sound coming from my oxygen tank, which means my regulator is busted. I'm not getting any supplemental oxygen. So I'm standing there with my Sherpa partner, Renji, and our guide, Rupert, and I'm thinking, Rupert's performed this rescue before. He's not going to let me die up here. I better stay calm and conserve energy because oxygen is vital. And I'm surprisingly calm in this moment of panic. Frankly, I just outsourced the panic to my Sherpa partner and to the guide because they're experienced and know exactly what to do. There's a little bit of fumbling around. I think that our guide gives me his working regulator and takes my broken one. This is what amazing leadership does. That's incredible. And then our lead Sherpa, Mingma, arrives from the back of the pack and seamlessly produces this extra working regulator. We had a spare, but we had already used it. So we were down to our last one, and he just kind of pulls it out of his pocket and is like, here you go, guys. And I'm able to proceed up to the summit. And Mingma, I should say, also, is a guy who's climbed Everest 21 times. The record was 22. It's now 23 as of yesterday. Mingma's an incredible climber. Mingma and Rupert, after our summit, go back a week later and summit again. These are incredible, insane climbers.
Okay, so you talked in great detail about kind of your fear of proving yourself unworthy of your team. That's kind of more of like there's different kinds of fear, right? That's more of like a fear that's not related to your actual physical well-being. It's more of an emotional fear, even though all fear is emotional. But I guess, was the oxygen incident where your regulator failed, was that the point at which you actually feared for your safety, or were there other points where you were actually scared, for your physical well-being?
The oxygen regulator is definitely when I feared for my safety. And there was shockingly little emotional response to it. I didn't know at the time if my oxygen regulator meant that I would have to turn around. Fine, I'm fine with that. Or if that I was going to turn around and slowly deteriorate and that it could get risky. I didn't know. I think at the moment when the regulator failed, I'm like, oh, phew, we can turn around now, or I can turn around now. I don't have to keep going. This is so fucking scary. But it worked, and I kept going. The other time that I feared for my life, I guess, or I felt like my life was hanging in the balance of my focus and concentration, was after the summit. When you're coming down, there's a lot of traversing on loose rock, and it's very difficult, and you don't have room for 2 feet. You've got just 1 foot in front of the other, and you kind of have to shuffle them because you don't want to be standing on just 1 foot when you've got like a 5,000 to 10,000 foot drop to the other side. And at one point on the descent, I don't know if it's appropriate to talk about this, but at one point on the descent, my Sherpa partner kind of is ahead of me, and he stops, and he's got this look on his face, and he nudges me and points to a body of a climber from some decades before. He's so close to us, and he looks just like us. And honestly, I didn't feel fear in that moment. I felt like I was invading someone's privacy. Like this was a private place and moment for them that I was intruding on, but I didn't want to, and I wanted to just move away from that.
Right. People often talk a lot about, Sherpas. They're sort of legendary on Everest. I mean, can you try to put into perspective like what superhumans these Sherpas are and just how valuable they are to all these expeditions?
Oh my gosh. So the Sherpas, when you're climbing these really high mountains, you can't see any skin. You can't tell male or female. Everybody's wearing hoods and goggles and oxygen masks and giant puffy suits. You can't tell. You can tell it's a person. That's about as close as you can get. You can't tell height. You can't tell weight. You can't tell anything. You can tell if it's a Sherpa climbing versus somebody else. They're like dancing. They're graceful. They're smooth. They're moving so well. On the upper part of the mountain, you can 100% tell when it's a Sherpa. The other thing is that the Sherpas carry all the oxygen tanks, which weigh about somewhere like 5 pounds, I'm guessing, each. They carry them all up to the camps and stock them in the camps, all the way up till like 27,500 feet. They're carrying all the tents and setting up the tents. Remember how I told you how hard it is to set up a tent on Denali? They're doing this again at 26,000 feet, 27,000 and a half, all along the way. They're carrying all the gear for the camp, the pads that you're sleeping on, the sometimes people's sleeping bags, safety gear. They've got everything, and they're doing this in multiple trips. The Sherpas, there are fixed lines from Advanced Base Camp basically all the way up to the summit. The Sherpas summit days before other climbers and are laying this fixed line and anchoring it to the mountain all along the way. I can't even imagine how long that takes and what kind of dexterity and focus it takes to be able to do that. Meanwhile, look, I didn't even set up my own tent. I didn't have to heat my own water. All I really had to do was move my feet and focus and get myself basically hydrated, make sure I didn't get frostbite, and move myself up the mountain. And it was still hard. Really hard. Meanwhile, these guys are doing that times 3.
Yeah, and I only asked that question because the climbers are often the ones who are sort of recognized for summiting the mountain. It's like, oh, there's these Sherpas too who just kind of facilitate it. And it's not to diminish the accomplishment, because even with Sherpa support, it's obviously like an incredible feat. But the Sherpas to me are just like the real superheroes on the mountain, because no one's helping them or carrying their stuff. And you've talked about just some of the logistics and the planning that goes into climbing the mountain, doing it in stages, and just setting up gear so that the people who are going on the expedition can effectively, their only focus needs to be just putting one foot in front of the other. But there are people behind the scenes who are making this happen while also having to physically climb the mountain too. And so I just want these people, as you do, to be recognized, right? I mean,
yeah.
Yeah.
The Sherpas are almost like the hosts. They're hosting us on the mountain.
Yeah, it's a good way.
Like they're very happy that we're there. They're so gracious. They're really excited to show us their place, to show us how to do it, to make us comfortable, to make us enjoy it. They're amazing hosts, and they're so friendly, and they're incredible climbers. It's an honor to climb with some of these guys. My Sherpa partner Renji, it's funny because, as you guys know, I was initially the weakest person on the team. And when they assigned Sherpa partners, I got assigned one of the best, most accomplished Sherpas. His name was Pemba Renji. And I know that moment when we discovered that I was actually faster than my team for a split second, I looked back at him and he had this great little smirk, because he was so happy that he had actually been partnered with me. He thought he was getting a lemon, and then he gets somebody who's actually, decent.
Yeah, and I remember after Denali, you were reluctant to talk about Everest, because Everest, or Denali in a lot of ways, is the opposite, in that you're the one carrying your own stuff. There's no logistical support. You're bringing it, you're setting up your own camp. And in some ways, I feel like some of your reluctance was related to the fact that you're like, well, if I do Everest, I'm going to have this Sherpa support, and it's kind of not the same, and it's not as challenging. But would you say that even with all that it was still a very just emotionally and physically arduous experience in a way that, even knowing there was Sherpa support, it's hard to articulate how difficult it is, even with the support?
Oh my God, yeah. What an idiot I was. I had no idea how much harder it would be, and in different ways. Like Denali is hard in that it's heavy and you're carrying all this weight and you're on the snow for 3 weeks and you can't take a shower and you're sick of the food and you don't have cell phone service. Everest is hard in a totally different way. The altitude is the obstacle that you have to overcome, and it only gets worse. It's exhausting, and you can never really recover. Like even at base camp at 17,000 feet, your body doesn't really recover. It's just sort of maintaining status quo. The higher you go, you're just deteriorating. So you're truly fighting this uphill battle, no pun intended. It was so much harder than I could have imagined.
It's one of those things where if you actually could have imagined how hard it was, do you think you still would have done it? I mean, it's hard to answer that question in hindsight.
I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I didn't know how hard it would be.
That applies to a lot of things, I feel like. So I want to, we have to wrap it up here. We're coming up on time, but you oftentimes hear about like how, whether it's mountaineering or some of these personal challenges and hobbies that people have, that they often have this narrative that they do it because, when they get back from the mountain or they get back from whatever that sort of external challenge is, they say, oh, well, it makes it easier when I encounter other challenges or adversity in my regular life. Do you find that to be true, or do you even think that's the right question? Like, to me, it's one of those things where we always try to like justify what we're doing with like in a tangible way. Do you think that, I guess, do you, number one, find these things to be transferable to when you go back to your regular job and encounter like a challenge in your professional career or in your day-to-day life here in New York? Or do you think that, maybe we don't need to have this overarching reason to do these things, and that just enjoying it in the moment, even if we can't quantify the carryover into the rest of our lives? Do you still think that it's worth it?
Let me go back to what got me into this. It was the books and the documentaries. And I loved that they talked about the struggle. And I really appreciated that. And it was overcoming struggle was really the appeal of these stories. The funny thing was that when I thought about climbing, it wasn't about overcoming the struggles. It was enjoying the moment and being in the moment and looking on the bright side, like being optimistic and kind of being resilient in the face of obstacles and setbacks. I didn't really realize, and I always tried to talk about my climbs in terms of the positive, like, this is what I did. I was able to accomplish this, and I feel like I'm exploding with gratitude. And I never wanted to think about all the hard stuff. I kind of shoved that down and let that go, and I didn't really want to focus on it because I thought that wasn't the glamorous part of the climb, or that wasn't the meaningful part of the climb. And I've come to realize that it's not about the summit. The summit is the natural turning around point that makes us, underline that experience as a win. But the real benefit and the real like growth that happens from taking on some of these challenges is in the setbacks. That's why the stories focus on the struggles and overcoming it. If you just focus on the highlights, there's not much meaning. It doesn't carry over to the rest of your life. But if you are willing to kind of go there and think about and let yourself remember the times that you were really struggling, that you were really low, when you were in a dark place, and remember how you didn't let that affect the outcome. It still affected you, but it didn't alter the outcome. Like, for example, I failed on this little day hike, but I stayed at base camp anyway. I didn't feel like I was good enough for my team, but I turned out to be fast. I was terrified on summit day, but I kept moving up the mountain. Nothing really changed about me. Like, I'm the exact same person. The only difference is that I now know what I'm capable of enduring, and that something is a temporary setback, and that I'll take it as it comes, and I can kind of handle whatever comes my way. I did feel that way right when I came back. Like, give me what you got. I can handle it. But that fades away over time. One of the nice things about Everest is that it's a mountain people recognize. It's a challenge people recognize. So they ask me questions about it. And in doing that, it reminds me about and helps me understand and process kind of the value of the experience. And that's, I do feel like when I'm really backed up against the wall and wondering how I'm going to handle something, I will think back to those moments on Everest. Not the summit, but to all those setbacks I overcame along the way.
Yeah, and where can people learn more about your journey? I know that you've got some social media where you documented the climb, and you've got some other things coming up. So if people want to learn more about you and what you've done climbing wise, where can they get that information?
I documented it on my Instagram account, which is at Reardon. And then I am doing a TEDx talk about it on Saturday.
All right, so we'll try to once the TEDx talk is posted on YouTube, we'll try to provide the notes to that TEDx talk and to the Instagram profile and the notes for this episode. All right, well, thanks for taking the time to talk to us, and good luck with your TED Talk.
Thanks.
This podcast is brought to you by Resilient Performance Systems. If you enjoy the material here, please check out our website at www.resilientperformance.com and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future podcast episodes, articles, and upcoming content, including training templates and live and online courses. The sign-up link for the newsletter is in the show notes. Podcast listeners will receive a discount on all paid content by entering the coupon code PODCAST. That's PODCAST in all capital letters. Additionally, please consider writing an iTunes review if you find these podcast conversations informative. They help us continue to attract high-quality guests.